will result in a harm that can be directly attributed back to that, but it does mean there is a corresponding risk. So, because of the radioactivity, and because even small amounts, even low levels of exposure can cause harm, but particularly with these wastes which are highly radioactive, they must be strictly isolated from the environment into perpetuity, really for as longer than we can, I think, longer than I can wrap my mind around. You know, we have recorded history for about 5,000 years. We have 10,000 years since the last ice age, and the half-life of plutonium is 24,900 years, which I always think is kind of about you know, I don't know if there is a typical half-life, but, you know, when you think from the 7 days of tritium or the couple million years of iodine, 131, 24,900 for plutonium is something that we can sort of wrap our minds around. And then we have to multiply out. That's 5 times the amount of time since we first had recorded history. Because of the radiation, because of the harmful nature, because of the long timelines, they must be isolated into perpetuity. And if there is a release, there is a corresponding increasing risk of harm. And so the repository, whether it's a at-site storage or a geological repository, as the NWMO is proposing, if there is a release, then there can be those radioactive and chemical elements of the waste can contaminate the environment. So the waste has to be managed for very long periods of time. In the short term, it has to be removed after 18 months and put into the cooling pools. In the midterm, usually after about 10 years, it's moved from the pools to dry storage. Now, I think my general impression is that overall in Canada, there has been a tendency on industry's part to leave them in the pools longer than that. I think that and they tend to move to dry storage more because of capacity, because of storage room in the pool than because of a real commitment to moving them into dry storage. I think given the ongoing crisis at Fukushima Daiichi, which really was a failure of the system, a failure in the system and the system's ability to maintain water cover and maintain cooling, particularly for the fuel. There are certainly issues around the reactor core and the meltdowns in the reactor core, but I think the larger amount of radioactive releases and the larger amount of if you can say there's a concern that's larger than the reactor core meltdown, I would say in the case of Fukushima Daiichi in Japan, the larger concern has been about the fuel waste, which was stored in pools, and with the loss of power, they were not able to maintain power and were not able to maintain water cover, and so we've had the very, very large releases that we've seen since March 11th in Japan. So I think that we may see a more rapid transfer in the future in both Canada and the United States from the pools to dry storage. So right now, the fuel waste is in the pools or it's in dry storage, and the longer term challenge is that those wastes must continue to be strictly isolated into perpetuity. So that right now, industry has been saying since certainly at least since the early 90s, that the containers were good for, initially they were saying for 50 years, the dry storage at the reactor station. More recently they've been saying that they are reliable for 100 years, but then the question is what happens after that, beyond that 50 or 100 year period. And I think the criteria that we would suggest needs to be applied, and I think that the industry would agree with this, is that, and certainly industry agrees that the waste need to be isolated in very long time frames. And I think given the quality of the waste, that means it has to be isolated really into perpetuity. Our view is that the criteria by which we should be assessing any long-term management option is that it must allow the system to monitor very carefully and in great detail for releases, for failure of the containers, for anything that is unpredicted, that was not predicted, any surprises in the performance. The system must be able to measure any releases. There must be an ability to retrieve and repair. So retrieve from whatever system, containment system, and then repair, replace, recap to restore the integrity of those barriers, of that containment system. We also think the principles that apply to waste management more generally should apply to waste management in the context of nuclear fuel waste. So that would mean principles like reduction at source and dealing with the waste as close to the point of generation as possible. So right now the fuel waste is at the reactor stations across in southern Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. And industry estimates that there's 2 million bundles, about 50,000 tons, and it's currently in the pools or the reactor stations. If there are new reactors built in Ontario, the waste will be, there is a proposal to build up to 4 new reactors at Darlington that's gone through a partial assessment hearing. It will produce a different form of waste with higher levels of heat and radioactivity. And the work that was done by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization leading up to their 2005 recommendation didn't consider other forms of waste. So what's being proposed by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is a geological repository. They call it adaptive phase management, and we'll talk about some of the details of that. But basically, it's very much like the proposal made by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited in the late 80s that was reviewed in the 1990s. A couple of significant differences. One is that the ACL concept was always looking at the Canadian Shield, at the granite rock formations of the Canadian Shield. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization has broadened that to include the sedimentary rocks, things like limestone and shale in southern Ontario. But it's still largely the same concept of surface structures, access shafts, tunnels, a series of caverns, and the waste placed in containers in that cavern. So in 2005, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization made their proposal to the federal government, and they called it adaptive phase management. And what they package as adaptive phase management includes both the concept, the idea of a geological repository, of placing the waste deep underground, but also their siting process, the way by which they will arrive at site selection. And it also includes, because what they were asked to study in 2002 through the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, they were asked to look at storage at site, centralized storage, and geological repository as described by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, based on the work previously done by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. What they proposed, they called adaptive waste management, and they said that it incorporated all 3 of those concepts because the waste would be continued to be stored at site. They introduced the option of centralized storage after having identified the location for a geological repository. So that's the centralized storage, and we'll come back and talk about that in the siting process, because that's a very important feature that was not there in the ACL proposal, and that I think we need to really be very aware of. And then the geological repository, very similar to ACL's previous proposal. So ACL started out in the early 90s, up until the last day of the technical hearings in 1996 federal hearing. They were talking about titanium containers in the floor. The last day they introduced a copper case container, which would be in-room placement, and that's what NWMO has brought forward. So it is a little different from the first concept introduced by ACL, and where they focus most of their research, but it is similar to their second case study they introduced at the end of the hearings. So where the geological disposal concept came from in Canada, it started with a 3-person, 3-month review process called the Hare Commission, and they recommended geological, they called it geological disposal in the Canadian Shield. From that, ACL began research efforts. Atomic Energy of Canada Limited was, until very recently, and may still be, I'm not sure if the contract has been signed, but the Crown Corporation, funded by the taxpayers of Canada, to research and promote nuclear technologies in Canada and for export. And they were charged with the research for the long-term management of the nuclear fuel waste. 77 to 81, they looked for some, they did a site search. They were looking for either a research facility or an actual end facility. And then they met a lot of resistance, a lot of opposition to that. In 78, there was a partnership formed by Canada and Ontario, and in the early 80s, ACL refocused and began developing what they called the generic concept, the geological disposal concept. And that, in 88, was referred for a federal hearing, and the hearing then, the description was released in 94, and the hearing happened from 95 to 97, and this was the ACL geological disposal concept. So very similar to what NWMO has brought forward now. In 1998, there was an 8-person panel, 10-year review, and they came to their conclusion, and they recommended an independent agency, arm's length from industry and government, and they concluded that they were asked to, they had two questions. One was around the assessment criteria, and the second one was, has ACL, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, demonstrated the geological disposal concept to be safe and acceptable? That was their test. That was their question they were to speak to. And what they said was, they said flat out, from a social perspective, it has not been demonstrated. It has not been demonstrated to be acceptable. But on the safety question, they said, from a technical perspective, the ACL concept has, on balance, adequately demonstrated for a conceptual stage of development, but not from a social perspective. So it's sort of faint praise from a technical perspective, because they're saying, on balance, at a conceptual stage, but from a social perspective, they had not demonstrated safety. So, based on that report and a number of excellent recommendations and detailed recommendations about how Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations people should be involved in future steps of research and the need for a social and ethical framework and so on. The Scientific Review Group also issued a report. They were the group of scientists set up to assist the panel, and they came out with more the technical critique of the ACL case. And I think that there was not from the panel or from the Scientific Review Group, there was, I think, a general, from the panel certainly, a general sense that as long as the debate continued to happen at only a conceptual level, it wasn't going to go very far. And that some more, sort of real-world work needed to be done. And the Scientific Review Group made a number of observations about some of the technical deficiencies, and there were numerous technical issues identified in the technical stage of the hearing. And I won't use up the time I'm already over to go through all of them. But where we're at right now is we have a proposal from Nuclear Waste Management Organization which relies on the ACL concept. And there has been limited technical work done in Canada. They're doing more technical work in the last few years, but in the 2002 to 2005 study period, what the Nuclear Waste Management Organization did was largely literature reviews and recapping and summarizing other work that had already been done. So we've looked internationally for some evaluation of the safety case or the technical case. And I do have copies for Mayor and members of Council of this technical review, which was released last year, and I think is a pretty good summary. Has a bit more of a European, UK basis than North American, but I think it's still helpful, and it really is an international discussion when we're talking about this notion of geological repositories or geological disposal, as it used to be called. So there's a number of outstanding issues, largely around corrosion of the containers and the ability of those containers to actually, what's called the engineered barrier to contain the waste. The backfill, I'll just skip through these. So The backfill, which is the bentonite clay or another packing material, which both sort of solidifies the container, but also is intended to capture radionuclides, so sort of to attenuate them the way you might see attenuation in a municipal landfill. Same concept. There's issues around that backfill, and it's not, the current research is indicating that the attenuation might not be as was previously hoped for. All kinds of issues about those chemical processes. What happens when containers corrode and you've got a buildup of gases? The combination of chemistry, heat, the underground environment produces all kinds of uncertainties. And those uncertainties largely add up to some really pretty serious questions around migration of the materials out into the outer environment. Lots of issues which are not new issues around bedrock and its properties. The ability of any proponent to actually really make reliable predictions around things like fractures and faults, all compounded by what's happening in that underground environment. If you've got a damaged, what's called an excavation damage zone, a fractured rock formation because of the intrusion of to establish the repository, and then again those chemical heat processes can all lead to new fracturing and unanticipated or unacceptable releases. There's issues identified around the reliability of modeling. We really are being asked to rely largely on computer-based predictions for the safety, to demonstrate the safety, the long-term ability of the repository to function as predicted. And so there are lots of questions about how reliable are those over time. In forest management we think 10 years pretty good, 20 years getting a bit iffy. By the time we get to 100 years out using the forest management modeling, we think, well, it's just sort of a general idea. We're not talking 100 years, we're talking tens of thousands of years that we have to rely on these models to make these predictions. There's other issues around the lack of peer-reviewed studies, and then a number of issues that have been dragging forward decade after decade around things like human intrusion, inadvertent or intentional, and then long-term physical processes like earthquakes and glaciation and so on. In the UK, they're at a slightly different stage than in Canada. But what they have been doing is working on a siting process and on a sort of a general, more concept case. They've just released their document, basically a white paper outlining the siting process. But a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, there was some work done to review what's called the technical case. And what the UK Environmental Agency concluded is that, so we often hear, well, more work is required. We've got uncertainties here, more work is required, more research needs to be done. And that is, I think, all true. But what was interesting about the conclusions from the UK Environmental Agency is, what they noted is that work may or may not indicate that an acceptable safety case can be made. So it may be that even as work continues, that safety case becomes more elusive rather than more available. Because certainly the level of technical detail has increased now from where we were at in the discussion 15 years ago in the review of the ACL proposal. And I think there are more uncertainties now than there were even in the mid-90s. So very briefly, the siting process. NWMO released a 9-step siting process. They began working on it in 2007 and launched it in 2010. This is their overall process. So they began their study phase and they designed the siting process. And then they've got what they're estimating. They've sort of done a time budget of 10 years for their siting process. And that is from their review process. And I've just taken it out step by step and paraphrased it because that text is very, very dense. So step one is a step that they're going to continue until they have secured a site. This is all according to their siting process. So until they have secured a site, until they have a formal ratified agreement with a community, they're going to continue what they call Step 1, so their awareness program. And what they've been doing in that awareness program to date, from what we've been able to gather, are things like going to the FUNA meetings, the NOMO meetings, the municipal association meetings at the regional, provincial, and federal level. So they go, and so that's really the audience that they've identified as their audience. They are doing some other things, some scholarships, and it's sometimes hard to tell which of those are related to their work for Ontario Power Generation at the Bruce site, and which of it is related to their adaptive phase management. But their primary venue is through municipal associations. So they're doing that to do what they call creating awareness. Step 2 is the step that Wawa is in right now, which is where the NWMO, based on some expression of interest from the municipality, do what they call an initial screening. And Chris and I went back and forth a bit, because in other cases, in other municipalities, there had actually been a resolution passed. And in the case of Wawa, it was based on your committee discussion and then an email communication. And that was what the NWMO accepted as the expression of interest. And based on that, they're doing an initial screening on what they call readily available information. And basically, they look at 5 criteria and say, is there any reason that we can see, that we can identify based on information that's readily available, that we know for sure a geological repository could not be sited within these municipal boundaries? And they've done them so far for 2 communities in northern Saskatchewan, plus Ear Falls, Ignis, Schreiber, and Hornpain. And in every case except Hornpain, they actually included areas adjacent to, in the area of the municipality, which in our view is not consistent with their siting process as they had described it. But that's something that we have to go back to them for a discussion of. So step 2 is where you're at right now. Step 3, if the municipality decides to move forward, they would then spend a couple of years doing a feasibility study, more detailed studies. In this step 2, what they do is they typically come in, they do presentations to council, they do the initial, or may have meetings with council, they do the initial screening, then they'll come back to town and they'll do 3 days of open houses and smaller group meetings. And my understanding is they're intending to take that same approach here, and it'll be for 3 days, according to the last email I had from NWMO, probably August or September. Mayor and council, or Chris may have more details than that now. But so step 3, feasibility. They look at they look for additional information, and they may begin to do actual physical investigations at that point. That's not clear to me. They do that work over a couple of years, and they'll do that work with whatever and however many municipalities move forward. So that right now there are 8 in stage 2. They could go forward with all of those. In step 4, it's the first time that they actually introduce discussion with surrounding communities and communities along the transportation route. And they have a longer time period for this, about 5 years. And at the end of this step, they intend to identify a couple of communities, 1 or more communities, that they would then move to more detailed work with. So then in step 5, if those 1 or 2, according to their siting process, it'll be 1 or 2, they would then at step 5 would be when they would enter into that formal negotiations, and the community would need to, at this stage, demonstrate acceptability at the community level. Up till then, they'll take the decisions of mayor and council. In step 6, there is an actual formal agreement made. So they begin talking about that in step 5. Step 6, they say they'll actually ratify agreement with the municipality. And that's done before the environmental assessment is conducted. And that's a matter of some concern to us. And we pointed this out to them during the design of their siting process. We participated in a couple of their provincial or national meetings. And many times, it's at the environmental assessment stage that you actually learn the details of both physical conditions and details of the actual project. So for us, it's a real concern that the municipality would be asked to ratify an agreement prior to an environmental assessment and prior to any licensing reviews. Step 8 is when the construction of a demonstration facility begins. And step 8, according to the NWMO process, according to their adaptive phase management, is at this point, if there was some I forget their description, but basically if there was some real push from the reactor communities, would be one of the reasons, to move the waste from the reactor communities, where from the reactor stations where it's sited now. Would be at step 8 while that demonstration facility is being constructed. And so while the investigation is still underway, the waste could be moved to that intended location for a geological repository in anticipation of a positive outcome of the investigation. That is, I think, a matter of real concern. It says, to me, I think, either one of two things. It sort of pushes to a conclusion that investigation, or it says there's a possibility that the waste could be moved once or twice or 3 times. Because if you think that this demonstration facility that's at the point where all of the assumptions about the properties of the rock and the fault lines and so on are all investigated in a real world way. If that proves that if the predictions weren't confirmed, then it means that you're either going ahead with a repository where the characteristics were not as predicted, or you're moving the waste there for long-term storage, centralized storage above ground, in which case there's no real advantage to having moved it to another community to do that, or you're moving the waste a third time, an extra time.